Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth conversation between Doyle Baxter and Max Krieger, um, painting a pathway through the ancient literature of the Western world. This week we read Aeschylus's Oresteia, which is a collection, a trilogy, really, of tragedies that were presented in 5th century Athens at a festival known as the City Dionysia. We'll get into kind of some background on tragedy in general, and then we'll dive deeply into these three plays. There's certainly a bit of a change in tune from what we've been reading previously, which was two varieties of Greek epic written in a standard meter called dactylic hexameter. In tragedy, you get a number of different meters in the poetry that are ultimately used to either kind of imitate spoken speech or convey some other kind of element to the story. So there's a meter called marching anapests that are pretty da 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 da. I don't know a good word for that, but it kind of brings you to kind of a sort of climactic moment and is certainly a suspenseful meter. But
can I actually interject there?
Sure.
Context. This was written in what year?
So all of tragedy that we have comes from 5th century Athens. And actually it's interesting, the Battle of Marathon and ultimately the Persian Wars, where Xerxes, or maybe it's Darius. I'm forgetting my Persian kings, but the plight of the Greeks against a much larger, much more militant foe seems to be of central importance in these tragedies. So ultimately, there are three tragedians that come down to us from this period, and they are Aeschylus, who we read for this time, Sophocles, who we're reading for next time, and Euripides, who we are not going to get to in our reading through the tradition. But all of them uniquely tied to the Battle of Marathon in an interesting way. So Aeschylus himself fought there at the Battle of Marathon, was a soldier. In fact, his epithet on his tomb doesn't mention the fact that he was a poet of prolific amounts of writing, but also great force and a good poet. His epithet is all about how great a warrior he was. So that's interesting. Sophocles was a young boy at the Battle of Marathon and was ultimately elected to sing the victory song back in Athens after the battle had concluded. And Euripides, legend has it, was born on the day of the Battle of Marathon. So insofar as tragedy could be a collective attempt at ultimately confronting something akin to post-traumatic stress disorder in all of these soldiers who fought at this horrific battle, and ultimately the Persian Wars, which were horrific, and ultimately galvanized Greece as somewhat of a unified entity. It's a pretty interesting line of reasoning there that a battle of such epic proportion is ultimately perhaps the genesis of this genre of literature that, in my opinion, is unrivaled in the history of the world.
There was also various tyrants around the time of this play, or preceding it. Persia captured Athens at one point, I think, before this play, or the Persians did. So I think there's also a kind of an ongoing war in this period, and then civil strife within that.
Right.
And I think this play is geared towards the democratic government and the unity. Not to jump ahead, but there is a lot of, I guess you could say, the tragic sense that comes through. And I
You
really
know,
like that way of approaching the play as coming out of all of the messiness of the state of Athens for the last century or so.
and trying to pave a road towards true civilization. I think that comes out a lot in this play. So, kind of without further ado, I'd like to discuss some of the mythic backstory of the Oresteia because it, I think, is much more important than perhaps maybe the cursory reader who just picks the book off the shelf would know. There's a hell of a lot that's going on in the cultural conscience when these plays are being performed. So ultimately, the story of the Oresteia, as we're going to see, is ultimately sort of a failed Odyssey for Agamemnon. So the story of the Odyssey, which we didn't read, is the Nostos, or the coming home of Odysseus, and ultimately finding his wife to be faithful to him, and after some trials and tribulations, basically reacquiring his throne there in Ithaca. The story of the Agamemnon, the first play of the Oresteia, is not at all that kind of Nostos, that coming home. Agamemnon comes home ultimately to an unfaithful wife who's had an affair, who kills him out of bitterness and resentment for acts of his past. And then in the second play of the trilogy, Agamemnon's son commits the unspeakable act of killing his mother in retribution for her killing of his father, which results in a very ancient earthly power, the Furies, coming after him to, punish him for the act of matricide, and ultimately the deciding by a democratic jury and under the influence of Athena in Athens that at some point retribution has to end somewhere. And so, despite a terrible legal argument, Orestes gets off scot-clean for having killed his mom. So that's kind of the story of the Oresteia, but in the background, there's a lot going on. So it all starts with this guy named Tantalus. And Tantalus is ultimately the etymological root of the English word to tantalize, right? Which means to tempt, yet never satisfy. And so Tantalus had a son named Pelops, and for some reason or another, I'm not remembering the exact detail, Tantalus kills his son Pelops, cuts him up into a stew, and feeds him as a feast to the gods. And so that's his sacrifice to the gods to please them. And they weren't very happy about that sacrifice. The Greek gods, despite allusions to it here and there, including, as we'll see later, the gods don't usually look so kindly on human sacrifice. And ultimately, the gods put Pelops back together, bring him back to life, and Poseidon brings him to Olympus and teaches him how to ride chariots. Mm-hmm. And Tantalus, in punishment for this terrible act, was put down in Tartarus with the Titans, basically the lowest points of the underworld, where ripe fruit is hanging just above the reach of his hands, and he's hungry but can never quite reach the food, and he's thirsty, and the water always recedes at his approach. So he's tempted and yet never satisfied. So that's the story of Tantalus.
And you said that Peloponnese is where we get the word Peloponnese, or the Greek Peloponnese. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Pelops, who is the son of Tantalus, is the one who gives the name to the Peloponnese. That was his territory, so to speak. So that lower peninsula in Greece, beneath the Balkan Peninsula, there's that kind of island that is connected at the Isthmus of Corinth, and that's called the Peloponnese. So that was his kingdom. So it's this interesting, kind of meta mythical story that is the sort of underpinning of all of Greek culture. And you'll see that so with the descendants of Tantalus, and also on the other side, the family that Oedipus is from. Gosh, I'm thinking he's descended from one of the daughters of Cadmus. I think that's correct. But it's really interesting that these two families are kind of the genesis of all of Greece, at least from a mythological perspective, and especially in the story of the tragedies. So anyway, Pelops has two sons, Thyestes and Atreus. And I believe Thyestes is the older one. And I also think that Atreus is either more loved by his father Pelops or more successful or something like that. So there's this kind of Cain and Abel story where the older son is bitter and resentful at the younger son. And ultimately, kind of, instead of killing Atreus, Thyestes sleeps with his wife, which in a shame culture like mythical ancient Greece, that might even be worse than killing him, right? It's almost like the fundamental act of betrayal that you can kind of imagine. And so Atreus isn't very happy about that and banishes Thyestes, but keeps his sons, Thyestes' sons, in Argos, which is where Atreus is king of. And he summons Thyestes back from exile in an attempt, supposedly, to make peace with him. And he throws Thyestes a banquet. And kind of repeating the sins of his grandfather, Atreus kills the sons of Thyestes and has them made into a stew and served to Thyestes for dinner. And only after Thyestes has feasted on the meal does Atreus bring in the heads of Thyestes' two sons and tell him what he's done, and that he's just eaten his two sons, and he throws up and leaves, flees into exile with his one remaining son, whose name is Aegisthus. And, well, Atreus isn't a very good guy. It doesn't seem, and it's really it's known as the curse of the house of Atreus, and that's really what the story of the Oresteia is all about. And in some sense, it's also the curse of the house of Tantalus, right? It's just this constant repetition of errors from one's father, reaching down into the third generation, which very much echoes the archetypal theme from the Old Testament, where God punishes sinners down to the third generation. So it's the third generation from Tantalus is Atreus, and he repeats the sins of his father. And then the third generation down from Atreus is Orestes, who repeats an equally sinful act in matricide. And I think one of the themes of the Oresteia is that the buck has to stop somewhere in order for civilization to thrive and to continue.
You also see in the family tree, I don't know if this is meant to be that way, but from Pelops, you get a divided house in Atreus and Thyestes. And I thought that might be representative of a divided Greece in some ways. And we'll get to talking about the end of the play, but I think the ultimate theme, even from the family tree, or it speaks through the family tree, is a way to end generational conflict with unity.
Yeah.
And I think
I think that's right. And I think that's kind of that point is reinforced when we consider the two sons of Atreus, right, are Agamemnon and Menelaus. And they are, in some sense, they're two of the more important personages in the Iliad and the whole story of the Trojan War. And the interesting point of fact is that Helen, Menelaus's wife, and Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, are actually sisters. And these two sisters are married off to these two brothers, and both of these women kind of exemplify a certain amount of punishment, generational punishment, right? I mean, Helen, the unfaithful wife who ultimately starts the Trojan War by being swept off her feet by Paris, and Clytemnestra, who is not faithful to her husband, who in fact has an affair with Aegisthus, who is that remaining son of Thyestes, and is waiting at home to kill Agamemnon when he finally returns. The two women are in some sense instantiations of generational punishment.
Yeah. There is there's a very different tone and style than the previous two texts. I felt like this set of plays, this trilogy, was more modern in its poetic language and verse than the Iliad. Um, and it's also much more concerned with the personal and the psychological than Homer or Hesiod was. I think that gives a very different sense of Greek culture as it's portrayed. Um, do you know if there what actually changed in the writing style, or what might have prompted that change from the epic story of massive armies and gods to the tragedies of a few people?
Of persons. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, I mean, I think from a less meaningful answer might be that both Homer and Hesiod have God knows how long of oral tradition to pull from when they wrote their works. And while the tragedians, in Aeschylus's word, are slices from the banquet of Homer, their conveyance, their style, isn't oral poetry because it wasn't oral poetry. They're taking these stories that are only alluded to, perhaps in Homer, and bringing them alive in a particular context. I had a friend in college, you know him, Eddie Hoffman. He wrote a thesis on tragedy and advanced the claim that I kind of alluded to earlier, that the process of Greek tragedy and this whole festival at the city Dionysia, which I'll describe in a moment, was an active collective. What would you call it? A kind of a communal reflection on the tragic nature of existence, and that provided a catharsis and ultimately a resolution to what was more than likely kind of mass post-traumatic stress disorder. He had some incredible research that basically more or less proves that the city Dionysia, this festival in celebration of the god Dionysus, who is a really interesting god for a number of reasons. The first of which is that he is kind of like the god who is killed and reborn and is ever new, and thus he embodies a sort of chaotic rejuvenation. He is also the god of wine, for example, and so anyway, he was able to demonstrate that those attending these tragedies that were presented over the course of 3 days, 3 trilogies, one each day, by 3 different poets, and that it was all a collective attempt of this soldier society to really come to grips with the horrors they experienced in war and also the horrors they committed, which is, I think, a very different notion than Aristotle puts forward in the Poetics when he's interpreting tragedy, right? But I think it's also very much in line with that. It's kind of a step further than Aristotle may have taken it. And what Aristotle says about tragedy is the reason why it's effective is because none of the heroes or I guess anti-heroes in these tragedies did anything that any of us was unlikely to commit. Right, so Orestes, in my opinion, seems to be the kind of anti-hero of the Oresteia. I mean, clearly, the Oresteia is named after Orestes. He's the anti-hero because he did something that more or less we could understand ourselves doing. If our father was killed by our mother, and we lived in a kind of retributive society, we would understand that it's somewhat logical to kill her in retribution, right?
However, he doesn't share with his family in that when he gets to the trial, he admits that he did kill his mother. and is essentially agnostic as to whether that was the right thing to do,
Hmm.
while the other characters in the bloodline are self-righteous in their crimes. They're 100% justified. And what Orestes shows for the first time in the story is I did it, but I don't know if I did the right thing.
Hmm.
And that's why I have to submit to a court, which is above me.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that that's almost more implied than it is ostentatiously shown. Because I mean, I think there's maybe you are right because he goes and he is purified of his crime at Apollo's shrine in Delphi before he is before he flies to Athena, kind of seeking ultimately protection, divine intervention to be protected from these um, very ancient earthly goddesses of retribution, the Furies. So you might be right about that. I think too. One of the things that's kind of humanizing about Orestes is that, well, I think by design, we do feel justified in his actions. Like it's almost like when the verdict comes back in the Eumenides and it's like a 5-5 tie and he only wins because Athena was on his side. Um, did that strike you as surprising?
It did.
What did you expect the outcome to be?
I I actually I read a summary beforehand.
Mm.
Just because, as you were saying, there's that familial context, and it's sort of hard to understand the first play without any background. But I was expecting the deliberation and the trial to go on for much longer.
Mm.
There's basically Orestes speaks, Athena speak, the Furies speak, and Apollo speaks, and that's it. Then they cast their votes.
Right.
So I was expecting the trial to be much more like Plato's Apology than it was.
Right.
It's a very short scene. Um, but I think
Part of that might be just to keep the plot moving.
that's true. I thought it was a good attempt at a good movie courtroom scene,
Hmm.
a good
Yeah.
first attempt. But you see many other authors and eventually filmmakers really extend the tension of a courtroom.
Mm. Yeah.
Even in Plato's Apology, which is extremely riveting in that sense.
Right.
But I think that what Athena does with her vote when it's 50-50 is to end the curse of the house of Atreus. That if this sin or this matricide is forgiven, then we can move on in peace
Yeah.
as a
Exactly.
or as a family. And so I wasn't so shocked because the the first, probably 2/3, or actually I'd say the first 90% of the book is just a horror show. And so for there to be a moral, it seemed like at the courtroom scene, you needed a catharsis. And the catharsis was to end the curse.
Right. Because there would be no end to the story. You couldn't have a good plot unless he was somehow forgiven there. And this is one of the things that's really interesting about Aeschylus's portrayal of this episode. The story from Homer is in the Odyssey, and it's the son of Odysseus, Telemachus, not quite sure how you pronounce that, is visiting Menelaus in Sparta. And he basically inquires what happens to the heroes at Troy, and Menelaus tells them, "Oh well, my brother was killed by his wife Clytemnestra, and then his son Orestes kills her, and now rules as the king in Argos." So it's kind of very off the cuff. You don't see Orestes in that little snippet from Homer doesn't have the psychological depth that he does in the Oresteia, particularly in the libation bearers in the Eumenides. But kind of before we get into some of that, I have a lot to say about. I think there's a lot to talk about. I think about the libation bearers that center play, and particularly well, we'll get there when we get there. But I'd like to kind of to move through this play by play and really start with the Agamemnon, and see if we can't tease out a little bit more of a moral from the horror story, because that's what it is.
Yeah.
So I think, on its surface, the moral of the story might be, and I guess we have to cover the background, is that before Agamemnon was able to sail out with his ships from Aulis, he is held up by fierce winds that prevent their sailing to Troy to go fight the war. And Calchas, who's the same prophet who at the beginning of the Iliad basically tells Agamemnon that the reason that Apollo is plaguing them with disease is because he had dishonored a priest of Apollo. That same prophet, Calchas, prophesies that, Agamemnon, you're going to need to sacrifice your virgin daughter Iphigenia in order for these winds to subside and for us to go off and fight at Troy. So, Agamemnon being kind of really the reincarnation of his line. There's this repeat offense of killing one's flesh and blood, particularly one's own children and nieces and nephews, or nephews in the case of Atreus. But so he sends off for Iphigenia and tells his wife Clytemnestra that he wants her summoned so that he can marry her off to Achilles. And then he has her sacrificed, and then they go off and fight the Trojan War. And in that 10-year period, news got back to Clytemnestra what actually happened, and that was sort of the impetus for her bitterness, her resentment, her plotting, her affair with the mortal enemy of Agamemnon, the remaining son of Thyestes. Just this, just a really, so on its surface, I guess the moral of the story is don't sacrifice your virgin daughter to go fight a war. But I think there's something a little bit deeper than that, and it's, I think, a constant theme throughout the plays is the sins of your father you don't repeat consciously. Situations present themselves in which you can act in accordance with the sins of your line, or you cannot. And I think sometimes we forget about that free will element. He freely chose to sacrifice his daughter so that he could go achieve glory at Troy. And so none of these repetitions of one's sins are fated in any sort of way that would compromise your free will. It's only because you freely choose to do it, and it seemingly is justified given your ends and your aims, that it is even possible. And so I think, at least from that little snippet of backstory, it's kind of, first of all, pay attention to what you're doing. There's no one who knows the sins of one's father like the sons who experience them, right? And don't blindly allow yourself to continue on in such an evil train of action.
I couldn't agree more. There's this play, to your point, as opposed to the Iliad, presents fates, I feel like, slightly differently. But they both share in the characters in all of these stories have a response to fate that they can use. And many of the times their response to fate is what ends up in bloodshed and horrors and worse things happening. So I think free will really enters the picture, at least in this book, differently than the Iliad, when an institution is brought to bear on fate rather than the individual whims of a person.
Right, because free will and fate, the interplay of those things in the Iliad is much more a choice between two good options, right? It's Achilles' fundamental choice is death and eternal glory by fighting and dying underneath the walls of Troy, or going home and living a long life and being forgotten.
Mhm.
Um, although one sounds kind of hellish, although both have their kind of hellish element, they're basically two good choices, and it's a question of which is better. Whereas in the tragedies, we get the flip side of that, and it's here's a choice between two bad decisions, or here's actually just a choice to do evil versus not doing evil.
Mhm.
And the decisions that the individuals make in the tragedies are of real consequence in a way that perhaps the heroic choice of Achilles and Hector and those kinds of characters, it's simple. There's not as much at stake. It doesn't seem.
Indeed. What do you think about, given sort of the backstory we've been telling about the curse in the house of Atreus and the horrible acts that precede these plays? What do you think about the first book being named Agamemnon and his minuscule appearance in the play?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it's interesting, right? Because so he comes home. Clytemnestra learns very quickly after the sack of Troy through a series of beacons, not unlike at all that scene from Lord of the Rings when they light the beacons.
yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? I think that perhaps this scene from the opening of the Agamemnon is sort of an inspiration for that scene in Tolkien. But she finds out that Troy has been successfully sacked through a series of lighted beacons. Um, and she prepares her web that she's been weaving, right? And she takes, I'm not remembering exactly what they are, whether they're robes. I think they're robes of the goddesses that maybe were wrapped around statues. They're made of red
Or tapestries would be.
tapestries, right? Maybe they were hanging in the temples. And she, when Agamemnon arrives home, she lays out this red carpet for him. And there's this interesting scene where he resists wanting to step on something so sacred, but he also doesn't want to lose a fight with his wife. And so ultimately, she kind of very cunningly and very seductively, um, gosh, and I'm forgetting exactly what she says to him, but but she convinces him ultimately by an appeal to his greatness. He who is the hero of Troy, really, that he is worthy of defiling the gods in this way. I think it's interesting culturally speaking, this is why we roll out the red carpet for kings and politicians and actresses and actors. Um, and I don't know exactly what to make of that, why we've instantiated that, but I mean, it's red because ultimately it wouldn't show the blood of murder on it, right? But it's also,
Uh,
there's something that even Agamemnon knew wasn't quite right about this kind of greeting.
yeah. It would be really interesting to look that up too, because the fact that we still do that culturally in light of if this is the first time that red tapestries are used, it's a very bad copy.
It is a very bad copy.
It says something about, I mean, it could be like a memento mori, which is remember death.
Right.
Um, it could be like that for the powerful and the famous. The red carpet represents uh, what perils could lie ahead. But that would be
Right. Well, in that sense, that's a very positive message, right?
Mhm.
It's call to mind the story of Agamemnon when you are walking into a theater and you think you're on top of the world and you're the greatest hero.
Yeah, and sort of that fame and glory is a trap in some ways.
Yeah.
There is no, in any of the literature we've read, there's no great hero, no great human who doesn't end in peril. Maybe Odysseus would be the exception there.
Oh no,
It's,
his trial getting home is it takes 10 years for him to get home after the war.
but he does get home.
He does get home.
But Achilles, Hector, Paris, Priam, Agamemnon, all of these people end in despair. It's a very interesting relationship between fame or power and demise in these stories.
Well, it's sort of like the bigger you are, the I hate cliches. The bigger you are, the harder you fall.
Indeed. So, um, going back to where we were in the Agamemnon, she Clytemnestra leads Agamemnon in, um, and then she kills him. But before that, there's a riveting scene with Cassandra,
Yes, I'm glad I wanted to talk about this.
who's Priam's daughter, king of Troy, and she is cursed to. I think this was from Apollo, right? Uh,
Yeah.
she's cursed to tell the future and have no one believe her.
Yeah.
So she
Well, and the story of that is actually quite interesting, right? It's Apollo wants to sleep with her, so she does, but right before he climaxes, she kicks him off, basically.
yeah,
And I'm not sure why that fact is important. There's a million other reasons why she could have been cursed by Apollo. Um, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about why that particular cause for curse might be?
I think maybe this could be completely wrong, but it seems that when human beings are given godlike qualities, that it is precisely in those qualities that they're doomed. That was true for Achilles. Um, and there's always a twist in the Greek story. And I think Cassandra's power speaks to um, how humans can never reach the divine in the Greek stories. Sort of the another cliche, the human condition. Um, though humans strive, no matter how powerful or no matter what gifts they have, they're all doomed in some
Right. Well, I was thinking just while you were speaking, this came to me that there's this sort of unity that the human is always grasping at with the divine. And for some reason or another, perhaps it's a metaphysical reason, I would be willing to argue that we are incapable, no matter how close we are, to actually grasping the divine. And the fact that a god wanted to sleep with Cassandra and she was only capable of taking him so far, but wasn't ultimately willing or able to allow him to climax, right? It's it's very much like it is very analogous to giving a prophecy that is never listened to, right?
Mhm.
You're godlike because you're speaking the truth, and yet you're just as worse off. You're just as you're not good enough because no one listens to you.
Yeah. There's also, I was thinking when you were speaking that, do you know the phrase from Nietzsche, amor fati,
Um,
the love of one's fate?
hmm.
And it's actually, I hadn't thought about this before to sort of compare Cassandra to Achilles. But when she is going to her death, as Achilles to his, they both rather boldly accept their fate. And I really loved that about the scene when she's predicting her and Agamemnon's death to the leader of the chorus. Um, they, it seems like the mortals given certain tasks accept their fate. We saw this with Hector too, when he went to fight Achilles. There's a sort of embrace of um, what the divine will commands in that sense. And it's,
She's a nice foil in the context of fate to the tragic heroes themselves because unlike those unlike every decision that Agamemnon makes and unlike the decisions that Orestes makes, free will isn't really an option for her, right? It's fate in the more traditional heroic sense.
mm,
It's fated to happen, and so it will happen. So I will accept my fate heroically, right? And it's almost that accepting of one's fate versus characters like Agamemnon, like Clytemnestra, who have a sort of, fated occurrence happen to them, the opportunity to repeat the sins of their fathers. And they accept it, not like courageously. They don't accept that as a challenge to live up to, but rather they freely choose to repeat the sins of their past. So I wonder if that's not one of the effects that Cassandra's presence really makes known, is that, because she's a great foil to Clytemnestra, right? I mean, they're the only two women in the play, I think. And what it means to freely accept one's fate and to be, I guess, to take up one's cross, sort of like Clytemnestra does. There's a nice juxtaposition there.
Yeah.
And an elevation, too, of Cassandra.
There is. The scene where she's foreseeing her death and Agamemnon's is sort of horrifying. She's overwhelmed by these visions and screaming out to the leader after she won't get off the chariot when she starts to have the visions. But I think what she and other moments in the play do, which is very interesting about Thucydides, is the amount of foreshadowing in the play. You always know what's going to happen next. And I think that speaks to the fate that revenge begets revenge begets revenge. It's sort of telling a repetitive story before it tells it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, Greek literature seems to do that a lot, right? Because the foreshadowing in the Iliad, before the death of Patroclus, before the death of Sarpedon, before the death of Hector, it's not very subtle, It's very ostentatious. And part of that, I think, is due to the cultural pervasiveness of these stories. They're so foundational that everybody knows them by the time they're like 4, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess what is foreshadowing? What purpose does foreshadowing serve if everyone already knows what's going to happen anyway? It serves to emphasize something about what is foreshadowed.
And just to circle back around, it also emphasizes what you said about free will. The foreshadowing really presents the characters in the play as making decisions out of free will.
Right.
If we as the audience can see what's going to happen in the foreshadowing sense, and not always even an omniscient sense, but just characters predicting, then you can sort of judge actions differently in light of that foreshadowing.
Because you would assume that the characters themselves would have had access to the same kind of foresight.
Yeah.
And so it allows you to not necessarily hold them in contempt, but to always be warned that it's kind of it's an injunction to really beware that little voice inside you that tells you shouldn't do something.
That's very interesting in the context of this play. It seems as though for Aeschylus, the most dangerous characters in the play are the most certain. And I sort of already alluded to this with Orestes. But he's the first one in the line who's not certain of his actions. I think that's what makes him stand apart.
Right, and we really experience that in the scene where he is kind of confronting psychologically what it would mean to kill his mother and resists doing it even. He doesn't want to.
And he's goaded on by his friend.
Right.
One of the things I really struggled with in the play was my own indifference to the plot. And I don't mean I wasn't interested in the plot, but I guess it's a moral indifference. And it's the sense that you it's hard to say that Clytemnestra was wrong to murder Agamemnon. And then it's hard to say that Orestes was wrong in murdering Clytemnestra
Yeah.
and Aegisthus. Did you did you have moral opprobrium for any of the characters as the play went on
You know,
and their actions?
well, I think the importance of the story is abstracting from the particular actions of the characters in the play and remembering that were you in a situation like that, or even one that doesn't seem like that but actually is, that you would probably act in the same way that these characters did, and that should give you cause for concern. So it was really more of a reflexive, be really careful what you do, especially when it's eerily similar to something that has happened before. Really learn from those prior mistakes. So I think that's where it's not really about the characters. It's about that arousal of fear, knowing that I could be those people in my own particular circumstances of my own life. Right? It's very much like an examination of conscience, I think, reading these plays, reading these tragedies in particular.
I agree. Would you like to move on to the second book?
Sure. So we're at the libation bearers.
This is, it begins after the murder, and we are standing at Agamemnon's grave with Orestes and his companion.
Yeah, and is it some years after the murder? It's not right after.
I think it was 3 years.
3 years.
And, or more, because
Yeah.
Electra can't recognize her brother
Right.
except by the matching of their hair.
Right.
Because Orestes cuts off a lock or two locks and places it at his father's grave of his hair.
So the thing that I really want to talk about here is, and it's hard to do because we haven't read the Oedipus story yet. But I think that there is a very, how do you call it? The story of Orestes in the libation bearers is eerily similar to the story of Oedipus, because ultimately he's on a quest to kill his mother and his father. Well, of course, or not father. His what would you call it? His mom's adulterous male lover, and he doesn't seem to have any qualms about killing Aegisthus, and he does so rather heroically, rather quickly. But then there's that kind of frozen moment where he's really coming to, well, when he finally decides that he's going to embark and do it anyway, he says he's going to kill Aegisthus and doesn't mention his mother anyway, and then he goes off, and then he knocks on the doors of the palace, and rather than seeing Aegisthus first, he sees his mother. And so he makes up this story that he's a traveler that's bringing word to Argos of the death of Orestes.
Mm.
And it's supposed to, well, Clytemnestra feigns or fakes being, distraught about this, and is ultimately kind of giddy, right? It's like, oh, could it possibly be so that he's gone and I don't have to worry about him coming to kill me?
And just think about that too. What kind of mother wouldn't recognize her son at her door?
Right.
There is something extremely dark about that.
Well, just that woman is, I mean, I can't exactly put my tongue on an adjective that's appropriate for her, because ultimately, when Orestes has already killed Aegisthus and is about to kill her, she tempts him to like enter into an Oedipal relationship with her and to live and lie with her.
Mm-hmm. No, I do have to take back something I said earlier. I said I didn't find any moral opprobrium in the characters. She was terrible in the text.
Yeah.
Her personality is the witch or the evil stepmother. She's and the way she basks in killing her husband and the way she responds to the chorus after that, it's a strangely accurate representation of a very sick and delusional person.
Yeah. What does her character remind you of in terms of like a spirit that does she remind you of anyone in the modern world? Not necessarily any specific person, but any particular attitude that certain people have.
Yeah, I was unaware we were going to be talking about Hillary Clinton tonight, but
Oh, jeez. That is kind of what I was hoping you'd say, but I wasn't entirely convinced on that.
um,
I meant more from an archetypal perspective. What if these characters are too distant from our own experience? We're not capable of learning anything from their story. And so I was curious if you could call to mind a particular example from modern literature or movies or real life.
I'd have to think about that. The first person who came to mind was Claire Underwood in House of Cards.
Interesting.
She has, the sociopathic qualities that you see, although she's more composed than Clytemnestra, I think.
Mhm.
But also the self-justification involved in her actions, I think, mirrors well with the Underwoods. She's so sure that she's doing the right thing. And I think one of the most powerful parts of the play is the dialectic between the chorus and various characters, the way that they respond to them. But after she murders her husband and the chorus is questioning her, she doubles, triples, and quadruples down on it. And then, sort of as if nothing bad happened, all she did was good, all she did was justified. She takes power over the land. And Aegisthus speaks to this, but he imposes a kind of tyranny on the people
Yeah.
of the land. And I thought that, at least maybe archetypally, as you were asking, there's this relationship between tyranny and revenge that comes out in the text.
Yeah.
Um, there, this all collects in the self-justification of an evil act too that you see in Clytemnestra. But tyrants are certain; they have to be. They're absolute.
Right.
Everything's absolute. And I think just to juxtapose this to Orestes, after he kills his mother, he's filled with doubt.
Right.
After she kills Agamemnon, she's filled with certainty and self-justification and even self-praise.
I didn't have this in mind when I asked you the question, but now that we're kind of going down this, I think I do have, I mean, just like you were saying with tyrants and their willingness to suspend reality for the sake of their own ideological viewpoint.
Mm.
Clytemnestra, in a very eerie way, kind of reminds me of everything that's wrong with communism and Marxism. Because, right, in the Marxist critique is ultimately that wealth is not fairly distributed. And at least from an archetypal perspective, the mother has the responsibility within the family to ensure that there is an equal opportunity and equal outcome for all of the children, right?
Yeah.
And when you kind of map that archetypal motherhood onto the state,
Hmm.
you inevitably, and this is beyond question because communism is failed, and every time it was attempted to be instantiated, you had murder on, you know, cataclysmic scales, hundreds of millions of people killed in the Soviet Union and China, Cambodia, Vietnam. Bad things happen when you
Yeah.
are an archetypal Oedipal mother
Mhm.
attempting to assure equal opportunity and equal outcome for your offspring.
Indeed.
And it necessarily instantiates itself in the form of tyranny and self-justified acts of murder.
I actually wrote in the margins. This is on 170. And just quick side note, if our reader or listeners are interested in the play, definitely get the Fagel's translation because his introduction is incredible.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about Nazi Germany and the communist revolutions, and I was thinking about the relationship between the totalitarian and the need for revenge. So, in each of these um, systems of government, they require to get traction a group of people with whom to get revenge on.
Right.
Whether it's the owners of the means of production or the Jews or something. And I think the totalitarianism that we see in the text is what is born of revenge is totalitarian. The origins of totalitarianism in political systems come from a scapegoat, a group, someone to blame for all of the ills.
And one that is presumably justifiable, yet when you expand your level of analysis just a little bit, you realize how foolish you are, right? Agamemnon's killing of Iphigenia could truly be all that's responsible for what's wrong in Clytemnestra. But it could simply be that she just doesn't have her act together.
Yeah,
And that
she has the choice to, um, say, steal a lot of Agamemnon's wealth while he's at Troy with Aegisthus and go create something new in response.
right.
But instead, she thinks revenge and destruction are the only ways out. So she does have a choice too. It's not as if she had to stay there. It's not as if she had to kill him. I find, I don't know, just, I know we've talked about archetypes a few times through the texts we've read, but I find that this archetype of revenge and totalitarianism really compelling. I think that's a really interesting way to think about, I guess, how the personal maps onto the collective.
And it's pretty fitting and beautiful that in the third play of this trilogy, we're given the roadmap to not succumbing to totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So transitioning a little bit, we'll kind of give some backstory and then continue what is shaping up to be a really great conversation, in my opinion.
Thank the gods.
Thank the gods. But so after Orestes kills Clytemnestra, he does feel shame and fear and sees on the horizon the Furies coming after him. And at the behest of Apollo, since it was Apollo who goaded him on towards the act of revenge, Apollo shelters him at Delphi, to be purified, and ultimately causes the Furies to snooze while Orestes gets away to go find refuge at the temple of Athena in Athens. It's quite interesting. It's the ghost of Clytemnestra that reawakens the Furies and sends them after Orestes, who has escaped. And I think that there's a kind of interesting image there. It's through ritual purification, penance, perhaps, the consequences of one's evil actions can be put to sleep, but until they are atoned for in a much more substantive sense, you can never escape from them entirely.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's also, you see a really powerful relationship between Electra and Orestes emerge in the second book, the brother and sister. And isn't Electra something like, like a house slave in her mother's house?
I think more or less, yes.
Yeah. And so what Orestes changes in um, the sins of our fathers, murder after murder, revenge for revenge model is that he doesn't kill his mother for himself and Odysseus. He does it for his sister. He does it for his father.
He does it for the people of Argos who are under the control of a tyrant.
Yeah, he's not, and all of the previous motivations are for oneself, in a lot of senses. Although Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter might complicate that, but it depends if he did it for his own personal glory or for Menelaus.
Yeah, well, there is that. It's he's sacrificing his daughter for the sake of, yes, his own glory in battle, but also the restoration of his brother's wife. It's there's a lot more to it than just. Actually, I guess that kind of contradicts what we were saying just now.
Indeed.
Well, regardless, I think that there's an interesting, at least in noting that Orestes isn't quite like his ancestors.
Well, you could at least say he's not looking for power.
Right.
His end is not power.
Right, because what does he not do after killing Clytemnestra? He doesn't just take up the throne in Argos.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it seems, I think the chorus even goads him to do it.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't. These furies are after me. I have to run. I have to atone for my veritable sins, justified despite the fact that they are. They're still something terribly wrong about what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to go off and exile myself to go confront that before I can return and be king.
And he's at the fate of the court, so it's to go off and be executed,
Mm-hmm.
or return and be king, which in itself is quite different than any of the previous revenge or other.
His willingness to take responsibility for his actions is also unique about Orestes.
Yeah.
The fact that he's even allowing himself to be put on trial is a testament to his faith. Well, I mean, the fact that he's willing to, while defend his innocence, suspend judgment even on himself to that of what the court might rule.
He's a very powerful character in that way. And he's also kind of he's young. He's very young, I think.
Yeah, he definitely. I don't think we are told precisely his age. Now, the Greeks would have known how old he was, but I get the sense that he's a young man.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of moving into the courtroom, I guess. What do you think that this type of ending signifies in the story? Because one of the things that I found compelling was that sort of, how there's like narratives that create a people. People tell a story about their origins that ground their way or their culture and their way of living and their morality and such.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked that the court was ordained by Athena at the Acropolis.
Well, there's quite a lot of that. There's a lot of justification on the author's part, on Aeschylus's part, or not necessarily justification, but providing an original account and an original and mythical account of some of the realities of Athenian life. So the first is, why the hell do we meet and decide murder cases on the Areopagus, the crag of Mars? Why do we do that? Well, this is why, because Orestes was tried for murder here way back when. Why is it that at the foot of the Acropolis there is a temple to the Furies, who have been renamed the Kindly Ones? Well, this is why, because this is what Athena did, and this is, I think, this is the epic climax of the play. After the courtroom, really, and we can talk about the proceedings themselves, but the climax of the play is when Orestes has been let off. He's been determined innocent by, or he's not been found innocent. He's been found not guilty. And that's a very interesting point of note, right? And Athena even says this to the Furies. It's like, hey, listen, he's not innocent. The tie was broken, but so in reality, the trial was that he's not innocent, but he had to be set free because I was swayed by his argument, bad though it was. The murders, the cyclical murders, had to end somewhere so that civilization could truly begin.
Yeah.
And so now I, Athena, the establisher of this court system, I need to take in everything that is good and just about that system of mercy killings before, and I need to rename it. And I need to bring it, incorporate it into this justice system that will allow it to have the power to atone for the kinds of sins that only revenge killings could atone for. There's this interesting thought that I encountered in reading René Girard. He wrote a book called Violence in the Sacred and is reflecting a lot on tragedy when he does so. I'd highly recommend it to anyone. But he makes the claim that the more powerful the state becomes, the more capable it is of bestowing mercy. And that's might strike you as contradictory, right? But the fact of the matter is that the state today, the powerful state that we can envision, and even the kind of one that existed at the time of Athens, is capable of way worse punishments than just revenge killings. Right? It could annihilate your entire house. It could commit genocide. It could do any and all sorts of things. And there's kind of a Hobbesian interpretation there too, but it's along the lines of, because the state is capable of so much destruction, when it is willing to let someone off as not guilty, not innocent, but not guilty, and when it is willing to suspend the rights of revenge killings, it means that we've really moved on beyond something very ancient, very base, and there's something very new about it. And that's what's so interesting about Athena's incorporation of the Furies into ultimately the success of the Athenian state. Right? She wants to unite the ancient into the new, give it life, give it new purpose and new meaning, but keeping it around. There's this very interesting interplay between conservation, conservatism, and the need to innovate and liberalism in the third play. And I would love to hear some of your comments.
I'd really like that reflection. You've got me caught between 4 or 5 thoughts here. The state. No, I really liked what you said about conservatism with the new. I don't know if this is the first, because obviously we don't have all of the plays, but you see this turn from the glory of individuals, like Achilles or Agamemnon, to something bigger than the heroic ethos. Um, it's not about glory or personal success or personal fulfillment. Um, there's something new that emerges here, but nothing that Aeschylus says in the plays contradicts the mythology, or I guess theology, in the original myths.
Right? They are like it's the perfect vehicle for conservative attempts at change, right? Because he's telling stories that everybody is familiar with and changing the details so that he's bringing new life to the ancient stories so that we can learn something from them again.
Yeah,
Kind of continuing on what you said about there's about the heroes and the individual glory diminishes and the individual responsibility increases from epic to tragedy. And it's like the individual diminishes only insofar as his responsibility is heightened and his ability to be an active member in a state like Athens is dependent not upon his seeking of not upon his individualized seeking of glory, but upon his individualized pursuit at being good.
mhm. And
And democracy is predicated on that.
we talked about Homer's critique of war in um, the Iliad, whether it may or may not have been there and to what degree. I think we can say, sort of unequivocally, that Aeschylus understands the horrors of war and is
Yes.
willing to communicate them. And I think the shift we're talking about from the individual to the polis or the collective, it is something you don't see in the Iliad, which is the leaders in the Iliad make the decisions and the soldiers follow. But in this system that's created at the end of the play, the citizens get to look at their leader or get to look at someone who's powerful or even a fellow citizen, and their judgment now matters. So we're not in the situation where tens of thousands of people are dying for someone's stolen wife. Do you see the difference there?
Oh, clearly. Yeah, no, and I think another thing that this third play, it's kind of a different conversation, but I think it relates nicely. It's sort of a retelling of Hesiod's Theogony. And to understand that, we have to remember what the Furies are and how ancient they are. Right? So they are when Kronos castrates heaven, Uranos, and chucks his genitals into the sea, some blood drips out onto the earth, and from one of the creatures that is spawned from that blood, the blood of heaven's genitals mixing with earth, one of those things is the Furies. They're one of the groups of creatures that are created from that act. Aphrodite being the ultimate conclusion of that act, interestingly. So there's kind of a seemingly odd link between the goddesses of retribution and the goddesses of love. That's a pretty dark connection. Love is just an act of retribution. um, but more intensely, it's right. They're very concerned. The Furies are in this play about what will happen if they give up their ancient power to these newcomers. And for some reason or another, they were not involved in the Titanomachy, and they were not shut in Tartarus when Zeus and the other Olympians conquered Kronos and the Titans. And yet there's something interesting about them, and that's that they're underworld dwellers. Right? So even though don't dwell in the underworld by the compulsion of punishment. They do dwell there, and I think that's an interesting note. But also, it brings new life to the theogony and understanding that there is something very significant about this conflict between the new gods and the old gods. And unlike in the theogony, where the new gods win and lock the old gods in the underworld, in this story, Athena achieves victory over the Furies and at the end welcomes them into the fold, so to speak. And the reason I'm all bringing this up is because of what we were just talking about in a reflection on war. It seems that after this battle, there's a recognition that to the victor go the spoils, not so much. No, we have to rebuild the defeated when we're finished. And I think this is precisely the moral of the outcome of World War I and the rise of Nazi Germany, right? If to the victor go the spoils is true, and well, ultimately, that's what happened after World War I. And I would make the argument that the Allies are very culpable in the rise of Nazi Germany because of the to the victor go the spoils mindset that they treated Germany with. And I think that this play serves as an injunction that the defeated are to be welcomed into the new order with honors and glory, not with shame or imprisonment or exploitation.
Yeah. This reminds me of Achilles with Priam as well. Their moment of forgiveness. But I think you're completely right. There's this sense in which no part is worthless, like the Furies. But that things which, like the Furies who create revenge or have this sort of anarchic justice, they can have a use in an institution. So you never throw away the virtues of something. They can be renewed in new forms.
And in fact, they must be over time. There is something you mentioned at the very outset of that there's something remarkably modern about these plays.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so interesting as we're talking. What it's reminding me of is kind of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And the reason that speech is so important is so that the truth does not die, and that the truth is ever reinvigorated by the process of dialogue and argument.
And I haven't read it or researched it too much, but you also have Milton's Areopagitica, which is one of the original defenses of free speech about the Acropolis at Athens, as the birthplace for free speech. Yeah.
Well, I'm not even familiar with that.
Maybe we'll have to add it to our reading list.
It's by Milton, as in the same Milton who wrote Paradise Lost?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Wow.
Because the quote I'm remembering from it, the speaker only says Milton's Areopagitica.
Mm. Well, then, yeah, I think we should definitely add that to the list. And it's just, I've had this kind of theory for a long time. And mostly it's because I studied the ancients in college, and so I'm very familiar with their thoughts. But I kind of found the Enlightenment period to be really unoriginal. It's like they come up with all of these quote-unquote new ideas that are revolutionary. And in my opinion, they're just pretty bad retellings of truths that the Greeks had already figured out a long time ago.
There's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun.
That is, I've mentioned this a couple times, but I think it's even more striking here than in the previous two texts. But given how old these texts are and how modern and different our lives feel, there's something so fundamental about them, so relatable. Um, I find that extremely counterintuitive, and maybe you don't have this perception, but I feel like a lot of times we get stuck in the sense that the past is um, dead and wrong. It's sort of a catalog of mere error.
Right. Well, I think that's partly due to the fact that what's right about the past is taken for granted in the present, and so all that's remembered about the past is everything it did wrong. And I think that that is just it's dangerous, right? For a number of reasons, but particularly because, well,
And
I, I
actually, no. There's a like one of the themes of the book is warring on one's past, the sins of our fathers, and so on.
and having the courage to overcome them. It's not like Orestes dis, disowns himself from his line. He goes back and courageously acts. He goes back and courageously becomes the king of Argos that he was destined to become.
Mhm.
And that ultimately means that he did what his fathers were incapable of doing, which is being a good king and not a tyrant. Well, I mean, kind of on this, just before when we were talking about change and why do these stories seem like they're so recent and why do they seem like they speak to us so well? I was listening to Jordan Peterson recently.
Mhm.
He said this remarkable thing. If you study chimpanzees today and you had the opportunity to turn back the clocks 100,000 years and go study chimpanzees then, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And that's because what works is what survives, right?
Mhm.
And so there's no innovation in within a chimpanzee troop. Now, of course, there's natural selection going on all the time, and that's changing things, but that's over much larger spans of time, right? And it's humans are kind of the exception to the rule that we can change so much in so little time. And yet, it's interesting that oral cultures are able to keep traditions alive for ungodly stretches of time. He was talking, Jordan Peterson was, about this. Some ceremony that Neolithic peoples did with bear skulls in caves.
Uh,
And we have archaeological evidence that the same ceremonies were completed over vast stretches of territories as a people traveled from one part one part of the world to another, and that tradition and that ritual of ceremoniously placing the bear skull was done precisely the exact same way
hmm.
for over 25,000 years. Right? So it's like the norm in oral cultures is that things stay the same. And it's only with the advent of writing that we don't remember things in our brains anymore. We remember them in books, right? When I need to look something up, I can go look it up. I don't have to have it memorized
Yeah.
in a way that an oral culture would. And so you might think then that it's like, oh, well, we're in this period of literacy and so we can change so quickly, but our underlying substructure, the archetypes and the tools that evolution has given us, the functions of our brain, all these sorts of things, those have not changed at all since the time of the Greeks. And therefore, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we're able to read this stuff and really relate to it. Maybe once we get over the mythological backstories and we learn a bit about those, the stories just come alive.
Sure. And have you read *Sapiens*
I have.
by Harari?
I have.
He I know you probably weren't the biggest fan of that text, but he locates the human ability to be unlike the chimpanzee in your example in our ability to tell stories.
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't necessarily want to get into a discussions of Sapiens because I felt at the end of it that I had read 400 pages for nothing. It was kind of a bummer. It was like there was this great, I mean, truly, really fascinating writing. And then at the end, I didn't feel like there was any purpose for the fact that I had just slaved away through 400 pages.
Well, I
It's
think
like, well, we might develop AI at some point in the future and be able to live forever, so we better be careful. It's like,
I
well,
think
thank you.
the main message I got from it, and I listened to it on audiobook, which is something I rarely do, but that was my Cincinnati to Denver drive, is be careful of the stories you tell. And that it's there's a certain responsibility that comes with conveying a story. And I just to jump back into Aeschylus, I think he really understands his influence on the culture and what he's doing positively for the culture. He seems like a very self-aware writer. And I think the story he tells is very powerful exactly for that reason. It's not merely a story, but its lesson also isn't imposed. If that makes sense.
Right? It wells up from the tradition, but also embraces the idiosyncrasies of the particular time in which the story is told.
Mhm.
And it's an honest story. He has he has a theme that ultimately is, it's, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but it's, he's telling a story that has a moral, and that moral is right. And
Mm.
we know that because when we act in accordance with the moral of the Oresteia, tyrants are toppled. We don't repeat the sins of our ancestors. We place our trust in the institutionalization of the importance of individual humanity. That's what democracy is.
Mhm.
And
The
that makes life good.
the justice is yours, not mine, or the justice is beyond an individual.
Right. It's a collective, there's a collective ownership of justice.
Yeah, and actually, you asked me at the beginning what I thought of Athena's casting the vote in his favor. Uh, I think that the really cool thing is throughout the book they just use the word justice over and over. Clytemnestra, Aegisthus, the chorus, everyone says, this is justice, that's not justice, let justice be done. And I was really hoping that we'd get a solid definition of justice by the end of the book, but it never comes. And I think
It
that's
certainly doesn't
the
come
point.
from Athena, does it?
Yeah, and I think that's the point. The system which Aeschylus is, shifting to, this democratic system, this court, the judgment of the judgment by your peers, is never said to be what justice is. You just get the sense that it's more just than this like familial bloodlust and revenge.
One
And
of
so
one of
it's not there's no utopian vision. It's a better than system.
Right, exactly. One of the things that Fagles really brilliantly does in the introduction, which honestly I've never been a fan of introductions. We've talked about this before. They always kind of sour me with before reading a book. But I was really, really glad that I read Fagles' introduction, and it was 100 pages. Like it was a serious intro. And one of the things that he does in the section of the introduction that deals with the Eumenides is he uses the word dike, which is the Greek word for justice, to summarize what's going on throughout the history of in the curse of the House of Atreus, right? Agamemnon's death by Clytemnestra is a DK punishment. It's a just punishment for his crime of sacrificing Iphigenia. And so he's using this concept of DK as like retributive justice. And then when we get to the justice of the Eumenides and letting Orestes go, he switches and he stops using the Greek word and starts using the English word.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is something to that justice is alive. It is changing. And when we are careful, when we are good, when we are, I don't know, when we're something, justice evolves and becomes better, right? It's not like that retributive, the justice of retribution that plagues the house of Atreus is a form of justice, which is in some sense to say that there's something good about it.
And I think I have your something, which is Athena, surprisingly, at the beginning of the third play. The reason she convenes the court is because she says, I don't know enough to judge this case on my own.
Right.
And so I think the something you're pointing to is a humility. It's the admission that no single person, no single rule, no single ideology owns justice.
Right. It's like retributive justice says, I know what wrong you did, and now I'm going to punish you. Yeah, and in a court system, justice says, I don't know what you did. I don't know what's right and wrong, but we're going to try to get to the bottom of it and make the best decision that we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there is a humility there. And that sort of goes back to our distinction between the totalitarian, or the relationship between the totalitarian and revenge, which is certainty. And both Athena and Orestes in the final play, the greatest virtue that they show is humility. And I think that's sort of the defining shift between the Iliad and Aeschylus. That humility becomes a virtue rather than pride.
Right. Well, I mean, I would nuance that and say a little bit. It's what the heroes are doing in the Iliad isn't pride, properly speaking, as it means to us today. But when we get the development of the virtue of humility, we are then protected from the excesses that a culture of glorification is easily can succumb to.
I agree. I didn't mean to make that absolute. I was just trying to be profound for once.
Oh, no. I mean, I think it was profound. Just needed a little bit of what would we call dialogical shaping, something like that.
Yeah, nuance.
One of the things that's really been striking me as we've been reading these old books is precisely how accessible they are. And I just wonder what sort of world would we live in if everybody, maybe not everybody, but maybe a lot of people tried to do what we're doing, to really go back to these ancient stories and try and learn something from from the wisdom of the past.
Yeah.
I mean, if I've learned anything so far beyond, the innumerable moral lessons, I've just learned that being sensitive to this literature and to the themes contained therein has the capacity to do a lot of good in the world, and it's leaving me compelled to spread the gospel of the great books. And I don't know what that means. I mean, I think what we're doing here is a decent start, reading them ourselves and then having conversations and posting them online for other people to enter into the conversation potentially. but I feel like we have to do more. And maybe that's just me being caught up in the zeal of the moment, but do you have any thoughts of that?
I did have the thought that I mentioned in our first conversation about the length of the speeches in the Iliad made me want to speak differently, with more confidence, with more reverence, at greater length, to avoid the sort of Twitter text message kind of speech, and really get into the describing or arguing for thing. But I think that I honestly don't know. Um, I think that any reflection that comes from literature breeds better people. I actually think there's some research on the relationship between empathy and fiction reading that I've seen. But other than that, I guess that I haven't exactly gotten a message out of it that I was so compelled that I wanted to spread it. And maybe that's a failure on my part.
Yeah, well, I don't know that there's a particular message within these books that is necessarily calling me to spread them. It's more rather the I feel myself changing, even though I can't exactly put my tongue on it. I feel like this literature is having a veritable impact on me, one that's measurable, at least from my subjective experience.
Yeah.
And I wonder what would happen if more people, if, I mean, I wonder what would happen if we were, as a culture, more sensitive to the moral of the story,
Mm.
whatever that story may be. I had this experience not too long ago, and I'm not going to share the particular details because I don't want anyone who potentially listens to this to know who I'm talking about. But I was on an airplane, and at the end of the flight, this person had finished watching a movie, not one that I had seen, but at the end, the summary sentence of it was, "Yeah, it was a really deep movie, kind of heavy. So I'm not sure if I really liked it, but it was definitely entertaining for the 2.5 hour flight or whatever." And
Deep as, bruh.
yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, well, I don't know what movie it was, so maybe it was a shit movie, but maybe it was really deep, and there was a moral that was presented. Like most movies are actually pretty good, and most of them have a moral that you can actually learn something from.
Uh-huh.
And we are so detached
Mm.
in such a bad way from that. We're in such a disordered way to be able to watch a movie and it's just for the sake of being entertained for 2.5 hours. It's like it's just that base. It's not
Yeah.
like it's worth going home and reflecting on.
I do find this interesting dichotomy in exactly what you're talking about, that the same stimulus you can use to be deadened or to be more alive. Like you could play a song or watch a movie or read a book to distract you from your emotions, your life, your identity. And you could listen to the same song, watch the same movie, or read the same book to enliven something new in you. I just, I think that we've never seen a time in human history, and perhaps this is arrogant to say, but where you actually had a populace that was interested in what you're talking about. It it's something worth spreading, but Kim Kardashian's much more appealing than Hesiod.
Yeah, exactly.
And
There's
I don't know how you produce or inspire in people the desire to do projects like this. It's a very strange project. Like what we're doing is very strange. This is not a normal use of one's time.
right. And we're basically committing a year of our lives to this project.
Yeah.
And more or less it's when I'm not at work, I'm working on this.
Yeah.
So it is an endeavor, and maybe even that in and of itself. I mean, and I'm not trying to virtue signal to everyone else, like, look how great we are for doing this thing.
No, not at all.
It's I have way more to learn than I have to offer. That's for sure. But I just can't help but imagine that there's something in these texts worth preserving, and that's why they've lasted as long as they have. And in particular, these texts. I mean, Aeschylus was the author of over 90 tragedies, and 7 of them survive. The Oresteia is the only complete Greek trilogy of tragedies from the 5th century tragedies that exists. All of the other plays that we have are 1 or maybe 2 of the set of 3, and none of the comedies that were the 4th play of each cycle was a comedy. None of them survive. So, kind of, and I don't want to beat this like a dead horse, but it's a miracle that these texts do survive. But it's also a miracle that, and a miracle that we can't necessarily access its importance of, that it's these plays rather than other ones that do survive.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm trying to say there is that if they all still existed, it's like you might be able to dispense with them. But it's, in some sense, time separated the wheat from the chaff. And we're left with these.
Yeah. At the very least, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Well, hopefully that principle applies to many of them, or more than all of them. Some of them could be by chance.
Right. But what do we learn from Sherlock Holmes about coincidences?
The universe is rarely so lazy.
Exactly.
Before we move on to life lessons, unless you want to say anything else about the play, I was thinking during that last reflection that I wouldn't be able to do this unless I was doing it with another person. And I was thinking that you were saying, what would it be like if more people did this? I think we need more communities willing to do this, more groups of people, not this, things like this. Could be art, it could be writing, it could be something completely different than what we're doing. But it's sort of, is, at least for me, I could not complete these books in the time that we have to read them, a week or so, or a few weeks in the Iliad, if I was doing it alone. If I didn't know that I had to talk to you about it.
Right. There's the aspect of community and accountability really makes it possible.
So I think maybe one possible solution would be we need to be able to request new things of our friends and the people around us. Things don't have to be this way. We don't just have to play video games. We don't just have to watch Netflix or sports. Like, we could do something with our time together. And I think oftentimes some people are scared to start that conversation for whatever reason.
Right.
That their own desires, whether it's literature, art, could be science or politics, but that's theirs. And then they go hang out with their friends. So that was just one reflection on that. One, I couldn't do it alone. And 2, maybe we could change the taboo around proposing dangerous ideas or dangerous projects with our friends.
No, I really like that, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I have nothing to add to that. I mean, I think that might be the vice that is contained within the larger virtue of individualism, right? When you privilege the individual, a lot of good things happen, right? Tyranny is harder to creep up, it would seem. More or less, life improves and gets better, poverty decreases, all of these other things that have been happening quite rapidly in the last at least 100 years. But the threat is that we privilege it so much that we lose the thing that made it valuable, and that is a sense of community over and against which an individual exists.
Hmm.
Right? The community gives life to the individual, and then it becomes the individual's responsibility to give life to the community.
Mhm. And with the community.
And with a community, indeed.
Perfect. Well said. Would you like to move on to the life lessons you got out of the Oresteia?
Yeah, you can take that one first if you'd like. I think I went first last time.
Cool. Well, I think that I was just like sort of itching to bring this up, and we definitely don't have to talk about it. With the social justice movement, the collectivization of identity, those kinds of things. There's this strange sense in our political climate that everything is a narrative of either side, and everything is someone else's fault, and those people whose fault it is are always on the other side.
Right.
And I think one of the beautiful themes of the Oresteia is it's nobody's fault. Just in the sense of it's like the curse of the house. This begets this, begets this. It's like a revenge after revenge.
Right. You could call it somebody's fault, but insofar as you participate to that fault perpetuating through time, it's
Yeah,
also your fault.
yeah. But I think the fault is, and we touched on this earlier, the fault is in our condition as human beings to a large extent, more than any individual or any single action. Um, at least I got that sense from the stories that the sins of our father sense. And you did enter free will into that, but I think the lesson I'm getting from this is if we pardon one, we end that cycle. So if we but pardon one honest person caught in this cycle, honest and moral and not committed to themselves, as Orestes is a model, um, we could find new life with that person. And I think that personally, I struggle with uh, forgiveness of other people and that reaching out for a different kind of future if someone has done something. And I think part of the story of Orestes is um, a certain pardon in a certain way with a certain authority.
At the right
And
time.
yeah, now we're giving Aristotle's definition of virtue. Um, can end cycles of otherwise ugly things.
And change the
Uh,
face of history in the process.
yeah, which stem originally from our humanity, not necessarily from our choice.
Well, hey, thanks for that one. I don't know if I can top that one in terms of pulling a moral from the story, Max. Thank you.
Yeah, you've got the muses on me tonight.
Well, I don't know about that. So as you know, I am, politically speaking, I do not fall into, well, let's just say I don't necessarily believe in the forms of government that we live in right now, right? I'm a monarchist. And one of the things that I often use as an argument about monarchism is that it better embodies the spirit of democracy than democracy often does.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes, I do believe that's true, but I think sometimes I use that as a cop out for expecting and demanding great things from common folk like ourselves, right? One of the temptations for a monarchical system is that it kind of hinges on the virtues and vices of a particular group of people, right? Namely the nobles and the king to whom they answer. And democracy ultimately hinges upon the moral decisions of the mob, right? And way more often do real individuals in collective small bodies, well, I don't know if there's an empirical argument for this, but I would like to believe that the less people there are in a mob, the less dangerous that mob is. But I think that the Oresteia, particularly the Eumenides, confronts me with the glory of democracy well instantiated. And I think that I have a lot to learn about the capability of individual people to contribute to the goodness of society on the whole.
Mm.
And that's where I'll leave that.
But yeah, that was a very interesting way of circling around to our previous conversation.
What do you mean?
About this project.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I guess we're wrapping it up. So
what are we on to next time?
Next time we are on to the Theban Cycle by Sophocles. So these three plays come from three different trilogies. So there's three plays that we have, so we're missing 3 plus 6 is 9, right? So there's 6 plays that are missing from this cycle. So it's three different trilogies, and we have one play from each trilogy. It's honestly exciting. I mean, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, that play is renowned by Aristotle as being the best tragedy. He talks about it in the Poetics, which we are not reading, but I guess we maybe could. It's not that long. Well, we'll come to that when we come to that. But it should be a great one, and I think that this was a great preliminary discussion of tragedy. And I think that ultimately the Oedipal myth is something that has really latched on in popular culture, thanks in part to Freud and his his theory that the failed hero myth, which is the story of Oedipus, his claim is that that's the fundamental myth of all of humankind. And whether or not that's right or wrong, the myth itself is powerful enough that it would lend itself to a theory like that. And that's pretty incredible.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to it. And
Same. So with that, thanks for anyone who happens upon this podcast. This has been Doyle Baxter and Max Krieger discussing Aeschylus's Oresteia, and we hope to see you next time.
I bid thee farewell and happy democracy.
Happy democracy.